Alexander Carter built an empire from the ground up. Boardrooms echoed his name, newspapers hailed him as a man who could not be broken, and entire cities recognized the Carter fortune. Yet none of that prepared him for the moment he opened the grand doors of his estate one quiet evening. His suitcase slipped from his hand as he heard muffled sobs that grew louder with each step. In the nursery, beneath the soft glow of a half-assembled crib, his wife Naomi sat on the floor, her body shaking, her arms wrapped protectively around the life she carried. Her face was streaked with tears, and along her jaw, a faint mark revealed a truth she tried to hide. When he dropped to his knees and whispered, "Who did this to you?" her answer shattered him. Through trembling lips, she whispered words that cut deeper than any loss in business. "It was your own family." Alexander's chest tightened, fury and disbelief fighting for air. This was not a scandal whispered about in corridors of power, not a competitor striking from outside. This was inside his own walls. He held Naomi close, her breath ragged against his shoulder, and tried to steady himself. But his eyes caught a tiny blink in the corner of the ceiling. A black dome, one of the security cameras he had installed for safety months earlier. In that instant he realized the truth could no longer be denied. He could see it with his own eyes. He could prove what had been happening under his roof. And when he pressed play, what those cameras revealed would not only shake his marriage, it would expose secrets powerful enough to destroy the Carter legacy forever. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Alexander Carter stood in the center of his home, a man whose fortune had been built on certainty and control, now staring into the eyes of his wife who carried his child and carried wounds she refused to explain. Naomi's voice trembled, her words barely forming. Yet they cut through every layer of comfort Alexander had ever known. She said the cruelty had not come from outsiders, not from strangers who envied their wealth or rivals who coveted his empire. She said it was family. In that moment, the air in the estate seemed heavier, as though the walls themselves had absorbed secrets too heavy to hold. Alexander's chest tightened. He had faced betrayals in business, yes, but this was different. This was his wife, his child, his home. And now he was left with questions that clawed at his mind and refused to let go. Who inside the Carter family could raise a hand against Naomi, a woman who had done nothing but bring light into Alexander's world? Why would anyone target her, especially while she carried the heir to everything he had built? What grudge, what obsession, what twisted sense of pride could drive a person under his own roof to such cruelty? These questions rattled through Alexander's thoughts with the same intensity that once fueled his boardroom negotiations, but now there was no contract to renegotiate, no stock price to recover. This was far more personal. This was blood, loyalty, and trust, all of it in doubt. He knew the answer would not only change his marriage, it would change the Carter legacy forever. And so the mystery grew heavier with every passing second. If Naomi's whispered words were true, then Alexander wasn't just a man betrayed. He was a man trapped inside a house where loyalty had become a weapon, and silence had become dangerous. What would the cameras reveal? What evidence had already been caught by the silent lens of the devices he installed for safety? By the end of this story, you'll understand how Alexander Carter, a billionaire who thought he had secured his place in the world, nearly lost everything. Not in the boardrooms where fortunes rise and fall, but inside the walls of his own home. Alexander Carter was not born into privilege. His story was the kind that inspired newspapers and boardrooms alike, the kind people repeated when they wanted to prove that the American dream still existed. He grew up in a modest town where every dollar mattered and every decision carried weight. By his early 30s, he had built companies that touched industries from finance to real estate, each one carrying his signature mix of vision and relentless determination. Colleagues often described him as uncompromising in business, a man who could turn setbacks into opportunities with sheer force of will. Yet, away from the world of investors and shareholders, Alexander carried a softer side, one that surfaced only at home. For those closest to him, especially his wife Naomi, he was not the billionaire whose name carried headlines. He was the man who still valued quiet dinners, handwritten notes, and the warmth of family. Naomi, younger by several years, was unlike anyone Alexander had ever met. Where the corporate world demanded sharp edges and constant competition, she brought a gentleness that grounded him. Friends described her as the type of woman who remembered birthdays, who asked questions that showed she truly listened, who filled a room with warmth rather than command. When Alexander married Naomi, he believed he had found the balance he had been missing, a partner who saw the man beyond the wealth and titles. And when she became pregnant, his joy was unmatched. For Alexander, the idea of fatherhood was more than a continuation of his name. It was a chance to build a home filled with the security he had lacked in his own childhood. Every glance Naomi gave to her growing belly, every smile when she felt a kick, deepened his sense of responsibility. To him, this child represented not just legacy, but love, the kind that money alone could never buy. Yet within the grandeur of the Carter estate, not everyone shared in this quiet happiness. Evelyn Carter, Alexander's mother, was a woman whose name carried its own weight. For decades, she had been the matriarch of the family, a figure who prided herself on strength, reputation, and control. To outsiders, Evelyn was elegance embodied, pearls that never slipped out of place, a posture that commanded attention, and words that could cut as sharply as they could charm. She often spoke of protecting the Carter image, of preserving what had been built, but to those within the home, her presence carried a pressure that was difficult to escape. Staff whispered about how her visits changed the atmosphere, how laughter seemed to fade when she entered a room, and how Naomi's bright smile dimmed little by little under her gaze. The estate, grand and immaculately maintained, often felt less like a sanctuary and more like a stage where appearances had to be performed at all times. The staff at the Carter estate noticed more than they let on. They saw Naomi walking slower, holding her arm in ways that suggested hidden pain. They saw the long sleeves worn on days too warm for them, the faint shadows of marks that seemed to appear and vanish. In hushed tones, when they thought no one was listening, they expressed their concern. "She doesn't laugh like she used to," one housekeeper murmured. "Her eyes look tired, even when she smiles," another whispered. These observations traveled quietly, never daring to reach Alexander directly, for the staff knew how Evelyn valued discretion above all else. And yet, the signs were there. Small, troubling pieces of a larger truth. Naomi continued to assure Alexander that her bruises were nothing more than accidents, slips on the stairs, or carelessness in the kitchen. Each time Alexander wanted to believe her, but the unease lingered, growing heavier with every denial. And yet, every time Alexander asked, Naomi insisted it was an accident. But the truth was hiding in plain sight. The evening Alexander Carter came home early was not planned. Meetings in the city had ended sooner than expected, leaving him with rare time to return before the staff had even finished setting the dining table. He stepped into the grand foyer of the estate, his shoes clicking softly against polished marble, and at first everything appeared still. Yet from deeper inside the home, he heard it. Faint, muffled sobs, the kind that make a man stop in his tracks. His heart began to pound, not from business stress but from something far more personal. He followed the sound, down the hall, past the staircase, until he reached the nursery where he and Naomi had spent countless hours planning for the arrival of their child. There, on the floor beneath the soft glow of a half-assembled crib, Naomi sat with her makeup streaked, her shoulders trembling, and her hand covering a bruise along her jawline. Alexander knelt beside her immediately, his voice breaking as he asked what had happened. Naomi tried to smile, tried to explain the mark as nothing more than a slip on the stairs. She whispered that she had been clumsy, that she didn't want to worry him, and she reached for his hand as though her words could shield him from the truth. But Alexander was no stranger to negotiation, and he could see when someone was hiding pain behind practiced lines. He searched her eyes, saw the way her body recoiled even in safety, and knew that her explanation was only a wall meant to keep him from pushing further. He wanted to demand answers, to know who could do such harm, but he also wanted to protect her calm in that fragile moment. Instead, he held her, his mind racing, his chest tightening with emotions he rarely allowed himself to feel. As he sat there, trying to steady his breath, Alexander's gaze drifted upward. In the corner of the nursery, barely visible in the dim light, a small black dome blinked with a faint red glow. The security camera. He had installed them months earlier, an afterthought to keep the estate safe. Now, for the first time, he realized it might hold the answers Naomi would not give. Later that night, when Naomi had finally rested, Alexander walked quietly into his study. He entered the code, pulled up the footage, and pressed play. At first it was ordinary, the staff moving through the halls, the sun casting long shadows, Naomi arranging blankets in the crib. Nothing unusual. But then the front door opened, and Evelyn Carter stepped inside. She did not announce herself. She did not pause to greet anyone. She walked with precision, her pearl earrings glinting in the light, her posture as rigid as ever. Alexander leaned closer to the screen. The camera in the kitchen caught Naomi pouring tea, her shoulders already tense as Evelyn entered the room. There were no pleasantries. Evelyn's body language was sharp, her finger pointed, her lips moving in words that the camera could not record but whose meaning was clear. Naomi's face fell, her eyes lowered, her hand instinctively covering her stomach. Then, without warning, Evelyn's arm shot out, gripping Naomi by the upper arm and shoving her back against the counter. Naomi steadied herself, her face contorted with quiet pain. Alexander's jaw tightened as he watched the scene unfold, his stomach turning even though his feet were frozen where he sat. He rewound the footage, played it again, slower this time, every frame burning into his memory. The confrontation did not end there. Later clips showed Evelyn standing in the doorway of the nursery, her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the crib with cold disapproval. In another, she blocked Naomi's path with a chair, her lips forming sentences that looked like judgments, and then a slap, quick, deliberate, leaving Naomi blinking back tears as she steadied herself against the edge of a table. Each motion was captured, each expression frozen in the lens of the cameras Alexander himself had placed for safety. He pressed pause, his reflection staring back at him from the darkened monitor, his throat tight with a mix of anger and sorrow. He had proof, undeniable proof, but he knew Evelyn well. If he confronted her with rage, she would turn the moment into theater, tears, denial, and manipulation. This needed to be handled with care, with precision, the way he handled every high-stakes decision in his empire. So Alexander Carter made a choice. He would not storm into her presence that night. He would not demand explanations that would dissolve into lies. Instead, he sat in silence, his mind sharpening into focus. He would prepare, he would gather every piece of evidence, and when the truth came to light, it would be so clear that not even Evelyn Carter could escape it. For Naomi, for their unborn child, for the future of their home, he would not act in haste. He would build a moment where deception had no room to stand. So he set a trap and waited. The next morning, Alexander Carter moved through the halls of his estate with practiced calm. He kissed Naomi gently on the forehead, told her he had pressing meetings in the city, and walked out the grand front doors with deliberate noise, loud enough for every staff member to hear. But his car did not take him to the city. Instead, he circled quietly around the block and parked beneath the shade of a tall oak tree, where branches reached low over the roof. From there, his tablet glowed in the dim light, the live security feeds filling the screen. He leaned forward, jaw clenched, every muscle in his body taut with patience. This was no longer about suspicion. It was about proof. Undeniable, inescapable proof of what Naomi had whispered through her tears. And if Evelyn returned, as he suspected she would, the cameras would capture every move. Time passed slowly. the kind of waiting that tests a man's resolve. Gardeners trimmed hedges, staff moved through the halls with fresh linens, and the estate seemed to breathe in its usual rhythm. Naomi poured tea in the kitchen, her movements careful, her shoulders tense. Alexander's eyes never left the screen, even as minutes stretched into an hour. And then, just as he feared, the familiar silver sedan turned into the long driveway. Evelyn Carter stepped out with the same polished grace she carried everywhere. Pearls at her neck, her posture unshaken, the quiet certainty of a woman who believed she owned not only the estate, but everyone inside it. She did not knock. She used her own key, walked through the door, and the cameras followed her every step. From the corner feed, Alexander saw her heels strike the marble with steady rhythm as she crossed into the kitchen. Naomi's back was to the counter, her hands trembling as she poured tea, but her body stiffened the moment Evelyn entered. There was no greeting, no warmth. Evelyn's lips moved in sharp phrases, her finger pointed, her chin tilted down in judgment. Naomi lowered her gaze, one hand instinctively covering her stomach, the other bracing herself against the counter as though she were facing a storm. Alexander's jaw locked as he watched the screen. He wanted to move now, to burst through the doors, but he forced himself to remain still. Evidence mattered. Patience mattered. The camera caught it clearly. Evelyn reached across the counter, grabbed Naomi by the wrist and yanked her forward, her grip biting into the tender skin. Naomi flinched, her lips trembling as if she wanted to protest, but couldn't. The scene was silent, but the cruelty was loud in every motion. Alexander's grip tightened on the tablet, his knuckles whitening as he kept watching. In the hallway, two staff members walked past, their voices hushed, but captured faintly on another feed. "She won't survive this house much longer," one whispered. The words made Alexander's stomach twist, confirming what he already knew. Others had seen the truth, but no one had dared to speak it aloud. The footage grew darker as Evelyn's actions escalated. In one camera angle, she blocked the nursery door with her body, refusing to let Naomi pass. Her lips moved again, sentences that looked like threats etched into every sharp expression. Naomi's hand trembled as she held onto the crib, her eyes filled with fear. Alexander leaned closer to the screen, his pulse racing. Then came the moment that nearly broke him. In the kitchen feed, Evelyn's hand reached toward the knife block. Her fingers curled around the handle of a long steel blade, lifting it slowly as though weighing its meaning. Naomi froze, her eyes wide, her body pressed back against the counter. That was enough. Alexander's control snapped into action. The car door slammed behind him as his feet pounded the driveway. He stormed through the side entrance, his voice cutting through the silence of the estate with the force of thunder. Naomi stumbled back, tears spilling down her face while Evelyn turned sharply, the knife still hovering in her grip. For the first time, her polished composure faltered, her eyes wide, not with guilt, but with the shock of being caught. Alexander advanced, each step steady, his voice low but unshakable. He pointed toward the blinking red light of the camera overhead. "Every moment," he said, his words deliberate. "Every word, every action. It's all recorded." But what happened next wasn't just a family fight. It became a police investigation that would make headlines worldwide. The sound of sirens cut through the quiet estate, their echoes bouncing off the long stone driveway until blue and red lights painted the tall windows. Naomi clung to Alexander's arm as he guided her toward a chair near the wall, his hand steady against her trembling shoulder. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe freely, though her eyes never left the figure standing in the kitchen. Evelyn Carter remained by the counter, pearls glinting under the ceiling light, the knife now lying on the marble in a plastic evidence bag sealed by officers who had moved with quiet precision. Her back was still straight, her expression carefully measured, but the tension in her jaw betrayed what she tried so hard to hide. Two officers stepped forward as Alexander handed them his tablet. They watched in silence as the footage played, the confrontation in the kitchen, the blocking of the nursery door, the moment Evelyn's hand closed around the blade. Every second unfolded with clarity that left no room for interpretation. When the screen went dark, one officer exchanged a look with the other and nodded firmly. Without hesitation, they turned to Evelyn. For years she had been the matriarch who commanded every room she entered, but on that night, her authority dissolved as the click of handcuffs echoed against the marble floors. The sight of Evelyn Carter, her wrists bound while pearls hung loosely at her throat, was one Alexander never imagined he would witness. The arrest was only the beginning. Within days, investigators searched Evelyn's study, a room she had always guarded as though it contained the crown jewels of the Carter family. What they found was more than anyone expected. Locked drawers revealed rewritten wills, drafts in which Naomi's name was scratched out entirely, leaving the unborn child without recognition. Hidden folders outlined financial shifts designed to strip Alexander of control in the event of scandal, placing the empire firmly in Evelyn's hands. Notes scribbled in her own writing spoke of protecting the family's image, words that now carried the weight of obsession rather than care. For years she had orchestrated not just influence but strategy, weaving plans to control the Carter fortune, even if it meant destroying the very family she claimed to safeguard. As news broke, headlines filled with the story of a billionaire household torn apart, not by corporate rivals, but by a mother's determination to shape legacy at any cost. Commentators speculated on talk shows, journalists analyzed every detail, and the public consumed the drama with relentless fascination. Yet for Alexander and Naomi, it was not entertainment. It was their life, their home, their child's safety now caught in the center of attention. And then came the courtroom, where the world saw Evelyn Carter without the polished mask she had worn for decades. Inside the courtroom, staff members took the stand. Their voices, once whispers in the hallways, now carried across the chamber with steady conviction. They described Naomi's fading smile, the unexplained bruises, the cruel words they overheard. One housekeeper spoke of the day she saw Evelyn grip Naomi's arm so tightly that the mark lingered long after. Another testified about late-night visits, when Evelyn entered rooms uninvited and left Naomi shaken. Piece by piece, the puzzle was laid before the judge and jury, not by rumor but by testimony, documents, and the irrefutable footage from Alexander's cameras. Evelyn sat through it all, her posture rigid, her lips pressed thin. But as each witness spoke, as each piece of evidence was revealed, cracks began to show. The woman who once controlled every glance, every word, could no longer command the room. Her eyes flickered, her hands twitched, and at moments she looked less like the matriarch she had built herself to be, and more like someone watching her own empire collapse from the inside. The revelation was not just that she had hurt Naomi, but that she had meticulously planned to erase her daughter-in-law and unborn grandchild from the Carter legacy altogether. This was not only abuse, it was a calculated attempt to rewrite the future. The courtroom fell silent as the judge delivered the sentence. Evelyn Carter, the matriarch who had once stood at the center of her family's empire, now faced years away from the estate she had controlled for so long. She sat motionless, pearls still at her neck, her gaze fixed forward. Reporters scribbled every word, cameras flashed and whispers rippled through the crowded room. Yet Evelyn's expression never softened. When asked if she had anything to say before being led away, her voice rang clear, calm, and chilling in its conviction. She declared that everything she had done was not cruelty, not betrayal, but an attempt to save the family. She insisted her actions were meant to protect the Carter name, to keep Alexander from what she called weakness. To her, it was never a crime. It was duty. The words carried no apology, no remorse, only the stubborn pride of a woman who refused to bend, even as the weight of her sentence closed in around her. For Alexander, those words were more painful than the sentence itself. He had hoped somewhere deep inside that his mother would show even the smallest hint of regret, that she might recognize the pain she had inflicted on Naomi and the unborn child. Instead, she left the courtroom the same way she had lived her life, unyielding, unrepentant, clinging to her vision of control. Naomi held Alexander's hand tightly as Evelyn was escorted out, her grip trembling but steady. In that moment, Alexander knew that the hardest decision was still ahead. Not the choice to fight for justice, but the choice to sever ties with the woman who had given him life. Cutting his mother from his future would be more painful than any business loss. Yet it was the only way to protect the family he now held close. Months later, the Carter estate looked different. The halls that once carried tension now filled with the quiet hum of new beginnings. Naomi gave birth to a healthy baby, the cries of new life echoing through the very rooms that had once held whispers of fear. Alexander stood by her side, his hand resting gently on Naomi's shoulder as he looked down at the child who now carried not just his name, but his hope. For him, this was more than an heir. It was a promise that the cycle of control and cruelty would not define the next generation. He vowed silently, and then aloud to Naomi, that he would protect their child not only with wealth, but with love and presence. He would build a legacy not of fear, but of care. Still, the decision to cut ties with Evelyn weighed heavily. Alexander had built his life on the principle that family was unbreakable, that loyalty was the foundation of everything. Yet now he faced the truth that sometimes loyalty demanded a different kind of strength, the strength to walk away. He never visited her after the trial, never answered the letters that occasionally arrived, and never allowed her name to pass his lips within the home. For Naomi, the silence was a relief. For Alexander, it was a wound, but one he carried with conviction. Because sometimes love means protecting what you build, even if it means standing against the person who raised you. In the end, the Carter story became more than headlines about wealth and scandal. It became a reminder that the most dangerous battles are not always fought in boardrooms or across negotiating tables. Sometimes they unfold quietly within families, where trust should live, but instead fractures. The greatest betrayal, Alexander realized, does not come from competitors or enemies. It comes from those we trust most, those who should stand with us, but instead turn against us. That realization was the deepest wound of all, one that no empire could shield him from. But was justice really served? Or did Evelyn's shadow leave scars money could never erase? Alexander Carter's choice was not one of business strategy or financial gain. It was a decision made in the quiet of a home that had been shaken to its foundation. He chose Naomi, the woman who carried his child, and he chose the future they would build together over the past that threatened to destroy it. It was not an easy decision, nor was it one without pain. But it was one that redefined what loyalty meant. And now the question turns to you. If you were Alexander, would you have done the same? Would you stand against your own mother to protect your wife and child, even if it meant breaking ties with the very person who raised you? Or would you have stayed silent, choosing the weight of legacy over the safety of the family you created? Your perspective matters, because stories like this are not only about wealth and reputation, they are about the choices we make when love and loyalty collide, when trust is broken by those closest to us. Every viewer who has followed Alexander and Naomi's journey now carries the same question. What would you have done? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And remember, this is just one story of betrayal and resilience, but there are countless others. If you thought this was shocking, wait until you hear about the man who walked into his own funeral, smiling. That story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about truth and deception. Subscribe for more real-life stories with twists you'll never forget. Turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next, because every story we share carries a lesson, a moment of reflection, and sometimes a truth that is closer to our own lives than we might want to admit.